you'll find the discussion very, very interesting with our distinguished colleagues, number one. And number two, of course, the Mideast is always in the news and always of interest. And while we're waiting for the expert to come, I noticed that there's been quite a bit of discussion, quite a bit of writing about the prospect, if you will, or the opportunity to try to come up with some kind of a Mideast Persian Gulf treaty. This type of thing, of course, has been tried before, and we all know back what happened to Mr. Nasser and all that type of thing. However, it has gotten quite a bit of traction. Oh, are you here now, Yonah? Can we start? Okay, fine. It has gotten, Yonah's here now, so we'll formally start, but it has gotten quite a bit of traction, and it may have some merit. It's always better to try to talk things through rather than take other kinds of action. And just because something perhaps or some idea didn't work years ago doesn't mean it may not have a chance today. And I noticed that our president mentioned it in his visit to Saudi Arabia as well, or at least alluded to it. So that's something that we ought to be thinking about. But at any rate, we're ready to go now. Yonah's here. And so, Yonah, you want to take over and introduce our superb guests and all that type of thing? Yes. I mean, it's not too early. You're ready. Okay.
Thank you very much.
We're only 7 minutes late.
Well, not too bad, I mean, there is a delay in the metro and all that, but at any rate, we're ready to go. Very, very quickly, I just have a few preliminary, I think, remarks. One, the purpose of this seminar that we try to publicize. We have information for you, but here that the rationale for it is quite simple in light of the president's visit to the Middle East. Just concluded the visit to the Vatican, and as you know, is on his way, probably in Brussels for meetings with NATO and all that. So I think this is the general background, and basically the idea is whether we are witnessing a beginning of the new strategic order, quote unquote, in the Middle East. So we have a very rich, I think, theme to discuss the issues. First, I would like to very briefly introduce the panel. Ambassador retired Gerald Firestein, who is currently the director of the Center for the Gulf Affairs at the Middle East Institute. He has a very extensive experience in the Middle East. We distributed the bio so you can see. He was an ambassador in Yemen and served in at least 9 different countries in the Middle East and Central Asia or South Asia. And I had the honor to meet him some years ago when he was a principal deputy assistant secretary for the Middle East, and at the department of the bureau now of the counterterrorism of the State Department. So I asked him to provide some context to our discussion today. Then we have Barbara Slevin next to him, who is currently acting director of the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council in Washington. And as a professional journalist, she contributed for many years clarity analysis to the situation in the Middle East, particularly related to Iran, where she visited many times. But obviously she's familiar with the other issues involved. The third panelist is going to be Dr. Nimrod Rafaeli, who's sitting to her left. Again, a friend and colleague for decades, an academic for many years. I may mention the University of Michigan simply because we have also one intern just arrived yesterday from the University of Michigan, but he was teaching, lecturing, and he worked for many years at the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and is now a emeritus senior analyst at the Middle East Media Research Institute that, provides great deal of translations from the region in different languages and contributing to our dialogue. And last but not least, our friend and colleague for decades, Professor Don Wallace, who is the chairman of the International Law Institute and professor of law at Georgetown University Center, the legal center or the law center, and he served and worked in the Middle East, particularly related to Turkey, so he can tell you more about that. Now, one or two other comments. Our meeting seminars are co-sponsored, of course, right here by the Potomac Institute and the Inter-University Center for Terrorism Studies, with links and academic relationships with many universities, think tanks around the world. And I would like to also mention the Center for National Security Law at the University of Virginia, the School of Law. And we have also today an intern just arrived from Virginia. We're very pleased to have in the audience friends, academics, representatives from the U.S. government and other diplomats who attend and contribute to our dialogue and discussion. But again, we do have, Sharon, where are you? Would you introduce our new team that's beginning this week? And basically, we're very proud of the opportunity to train, to teach the next generation of scholars and professionals. We have 3 or 4 now.
We have 4, but I think one's
where's
on the
fourth
side.
one? We don't
If you
want
guys
to.
can stand up.
So maybe
We'd just like to thank our beginning of the summer 2017 group. They've helped provide research support for Professor Alexander and also with helping with organize the seminar. You guys can just say your names and your university. Sure.
Hi, my name is Alexandra Hain, and I'm from the University of Virginia.
Hi, I'm Sally Oncheva from Stetson University.
And I'm Jillian Goldberg from University of Michigan.
Go blue.
Yeah, well, actually, we have the foreign student from also Bulgaria. So, we are very proud of that, and we work very closely, of course.
One last intern.
We have one more. So
Hi, my name is Nicole Heitzner, and I'm from Georgetown University.
Okay. Thank you very much. So, again, you would deal with these people the next 10 or 20 years.
Invaded by all the ladies. Where are the men?
I don't discriminate. Just wait.
I know.
They're
but
coming.
We're already going under.
Well,
I mean,
they're
taking
really
over now,
coming. Not all of them arrived now, but we have one more, if I may, one more former intern. Would you come up front, please, for a minute and tell us about where are you? Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Just say a word.
My name is Garth Keffer. I was an intern in 2014 and had the honor to work with the two of you guys. And now I'm a terrorism liaison officer with the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department and help out with their threat assessment center. So we do threat assessments on critical infrastructure and emerging threats or any other terrorist incidences in terms of suspicious activity reports that are submitted through the community or other officers. And so that is where I'm at now, and have a conditional with the federal government and hopefully go in there soon. So these two have been phenomenal, and I read their books that they both signed to me when I was an intern. So
Thank you very much.
so
Good luck.
it's a pleasure to be here.
We're very proud of you and others as well. Now, on a sad note, as all of you now know, we had this terrible carnage and attack in Manchester. Obviously, as always, we would like to express the condolences to the families of the victims and the wounded. And as you know, many were children and women. We still don't know those who were victimized or attacked. In fact, on a personal note, a cousin of mine is a professor at the University of Manchester in political philosophy. We were in touch with him yesterday. Thankfully, his three boys are okay, but there are many victims that we don't know who they are and so forth. Obviously, we always want to acknowledge the exceptional contribution of the leadership, for example, in the UK, Prime Minister May, as well as the professionalism of the law enforcement and the intelligence and so forth. Now, in addition to that, obviously it's all related to the discussion that we're going to have today, whether it is the Islamic State or the attacks throughout Europe the past year and for decades, including the Al-Qaeda, whether it is Belgium or Sweden or France and so forth. So I think we do have a Middle East connection. In fact, as we speak, there is a meeting today in Vienna with the OSCE, the Organization of Security in Europe, and we had the honor to cooperate with them for many, many years. They're discussing the issue of the foreign fighters, so-called, as well as the radicalization issue. Finally, one more word. Since we are trying to learn from the lessons of history, we always look at the calendar and see what happened actually in the month of May, the anniversary. And in fact, if you look at the record, you will see that going all the way back 26 years ago, in May, there was an attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II, as you know, by a Turkish terrorist, Mehmet Ali Aja. And here again, the interesting, I think, development that we had President Trump visiting the Pope today or yesterday in Rome. Now, in addition to that, I would like to mention one more anniversary, which I think would broaden our discussion. We're talking about the Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State and so on and so forth. But going again all the way back to 1972, it was May 30th, three Japanese members, or the members of the Japanese Red Army, they were able to bring with them weapons from Italy and to open fire at that time it was called the Lod Airport, which is the Ben Gurion airport now. And they try to kill, of course, as many Israelis as possible, but ironically, they killed mostly Christian pilgrims who came on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And that happened in 1972, of course. There were some other incidents, but the point I'm making is that we have to look also at the past to learn something about the future. Finally, one more academic or personal point. Since we're going to deal, Barbara, also with Iran, back in 1977, we organized a seminar in the non-Arab Middle East, specifically at that time, Turkey, Iran, and Israel. So at least we try to contribute to a dialogue. So the question arises whether that kind of coalition can be formed or we have to expect some other developments. Probably one of the issues we would have to discuss whether the only certainty is uncertainty, or can we expect too much? With that, I would like to invite you, Ambassador, to come up here. Would you like to speak from there? It's up to you.
I think it's better to speak from.
Okay, of course. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Alexander. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with General Gray to have this conversation today. As you said at the beginning of your comments, I think that this is a particularly appropriate moment for two reasons. One, of course, President Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia and also to Israel and the Palestinian territories. And the second, of course, is the rollout of the president's budget. And so the question that we're being asked to address today is a new Middle East strategic order emerging? I would have to say that there is a lot of change underway, but I don't think that it adds up at the end of the day to a new strategic order. And that in terms of the U.S. approach to the problems of the region, I would say overall that the new Trump administration approach is the U.S. traditional policy minus. And I mentioned to Barbara earlier that it strikes me that what the president is trying to do is to construct a one-legged stool that I think ultimately will not help achieve the objectives that he's set out. But we can talk about that a little bit in greater detail. What I would say is that most of the discussion that we've seen here in Washington and around the world over these past few weeks revolves around two issues. One is there a new lineup among the Sunni Arab and Islamic countries that will join with us in tackling the threat of violent extremism, as well as put up a new unified front in confronting Iran's hegemonic ambitions. And then the second issue is whether or not there is a new strategic relationship emerging between the Arabs, and especially the Gulf Arabs, and Israel. And I think in both of those instances, what we would have to say is that the expectations or the analyses that these are emerging are exaggerated. On the first instance, what it seems to me is that the coalition of states that came together in Riyadh over the weekend that met with the president is more or less the same coalition that has existed certainly since 2014, 2013 in confronting Daesh and joining with the United States in the coalition to try to push back these extremist groups. And there was really very little that was new in terms of the conversations. It focused almost entirely on the defensive mechanisms that we've used to take on violent extremism really since 2001. The elements of kinetic operations, the effort to destroy the leadership of these organizations, Counterterrorism Finance, which we worked on. Dr. Alexander mentioned that I was in the Counterterrorism Bureau at the State Department in 2006, 2007. CT Finance was very much a part of what we were trying to accomplish then. And that included efforts to get our friends and partners in the region to do more to cut back on financing by private individuals. It was understood that the money that was supporting these groups, in those days it was Al-Qaeda, today it's Daesh or the Nusra Front, were not coming from governments as much as they were coming from sympathetic individuals. So there was a lot of emphasis on that. And then the third element, the counterterrorism messaging, and of course the president helped inaugurate this new center in Riyadh, which has been under construction for quite a few years now, and mirrors a center that we opened in Abu Dhabi a few years ago, the Swab Center that the United States operates with our friends in the Emirates. So what the states that were in the meeting were discussing, what the president was discussing, was really very much a continuation of the policies that we've been pursuing for at least the last few years, and in many instances actually for the last 15 or 16 years, and talking to very many of the same people about it. What is missing now in the conversation are the other two pillars of our approach to countering violent extremism. And in my view, and based on my experience, actually they're the two most important pillars. One is the diplomatic approach, and there was really very little that was involved in going beyond what we have already established, going beyond the alliances and the coalitions that already exist, to try to build out and to get a more concerted diplomatic effort going to limit the reach of these violent extremist groups, and to work with our friends and partners in the region to help them address some of the challenges that they confront. And then the other part of it, also critically important, is helping them address the issues that confront them and that limit their ability to defeat terrorism. And one of the things I noted about the president's speech is when he called on the states that were assembled to drive the extremists from the mosque and from the communities. The fact of the matter is that in many of these societies, and I can speak from personal experience in Yemen, the issue isn't a desire to drive these extremist elements out of the communities. The issue is a lack of capacity. They simply cannot do what the president has suggested that they should do. And for that reason, for many years, our effort has been focused heavily on trying to help them develop the institutional capacity, to develop the institutions, to develop the economic opportunities and the security and stability of their own situations that would allow them to succeed against these extremist groups. But if you look at the president's comments in Riyadh, in which that issue was almost entirely absent, and combine that with the budget that the president just rolled out yesterday, you see that that approach is almost entirely absent now from the U.S. Strategy for confronting violent extremism in the region, and so in sum, on the issue of the violent extremist threat, I would say that we're still preaching to the same choir. But we are restricting ourselves and undermining our own capacity to succeed in that by some of the changes in the way that we evaluate the problem and the way we propose to treat the problem. On Iran, and Barbara will speak more extensively on Iran, the only point that I'll make again is that by giving up on a diplomatic approach, by suggesting that there is no diplomacy that we can pursue with the Iranians, once again, it's not clear to me that we are really trying to deal effectively or realistically with the problem of Iran. And while, again, we had a broad cross-section of the Sunni, Islamic, and Arab worlds gathered in Riyadh for this discussion, the fact of the matter is that the differences of opinion within those participants on how to manage the Iranian situation are pretty significant. Even within the GCC itself, the differences between where the Saudis and maybe the Emiratis are on confronting Iran and where the Kuwaitis or the Omanis or the Qataris are is entirely different. And so while, again, you might have a very broad statement, and I think that there is a unified view that Iran's interventions in the internal affairs of its neighbors in Yemen and Bahrain, in Syria, are negative and unhelpful in terms of regional security and stability. I think that to go beyond that and to try to come up with any kind of pragmatic approach to what you do about that within the context of the people who are gathered in Riyadh, you would have a very hard time coming up with a unified position and a unified answer to the question. And so I think, again, we're in a situation where the United States has taken a very forward position. We have staked out claim that we now have this broad coalition supporting us. But I think when it comes time to try to translate that from the statement of principles, if you will, to an actual plan or program that can be implemented, we're going to find that there's much less there than meets the eye. The other issue I'll touch on in terms of where I think people have been mostly focused is this whole question of the extent to which there is a budding Arab, primarily Gulf Arab, Israeli nexus building on the shared concerns about Iran. And there's no question that over these past years, the amount of communication back and forth between Israel and the Gulf states has increased. There is intelligence exchange now. There is a number of different areas where the states can cooperate. People say, well, after all, Prince Turki will sit down with his Israeli counterparts and have a conversation, which is certainly true. Whether that means anything or not is another story. But is there a context in which you can build on that to make this kind of under the table relationship actually become a de facto, de jure relationship between the Gulf and the Israelis, in which not only will they continue to cooperate on what they identify as their shared challenge, which is Iran, but can also work together to achieve some progress on the Israeli-Palestinian front. And again, I think that you've seen over these past few months a number of very optimistic assessments come out of Washington in terms of what's called the outside-in strategy, where the Gulf Arabs would lead the way towards an Israeli-Palestinian agreement, or they would take, the first steps in trying to achieve progress with the Israelis that would then encourage subsequent steps on the part of the Israelis and the Palestinians towards a bilateral arrangement. I can tell you that this idea has been out there for a number of years. John Kerry broke his heart trying to achieve something very much along these lines. I think that despite the fact, and you saw the president articulate for the first time this outside-in idea when Bibi Netanyahu was here a few months ago, and almost immediately thereafter, the Saudi foreign minister, Adel al-Jubeir, went out. He was in Italy at the time, went out to the cameras and said very clearly that the Saudi approach continued to focus on a two-state solution, and that the principles that were articulated in Madrid in 1991, re-articulated by King Abdullah in his Arab Peace Initiative in 2002, that these are still the principles that guide Saudi Arabia, and that is that as soon as there is an Israeli-Palestinian agreement, the other Arabs will join, they will normalize their relationship, they will begin to deal with Israel as a normal state, but all contingent on an Israeli-Palestinian agreement first. And there was, despite the discussion prior to the president's visit, that perhaps there would be some new initiative. You saw the Wall Street Journal article that talked about the things that the Gulf Arabs might be willing to put on the table in terms of overflight rights, telecommunications, which in the age of internet is practically meaningless, and other kinds of incentives to help the Israelis make peace with the Palestinians. In fact, there was really nothing that came out of the visit that changed what were the principles of the Gulf Arab position on Israeli-Palestinian peace. And my own view, again, is that it would be extremely difficult, both domestically and in terms of the regional standing, for the Saudis or the other Gulf Arabs to do anything that would be widely perceived as being negative for the Palestinians, not to mention the fact that it would be fruitless if the Palestinians simply disagreed and distanced themselves from anything, any Gulf Arab initiative. So, again, I think that there's not a lot that's significant there. Let me, and I know I'm running a little bit long, so let me just say a few things that I think are significant and will affect our position going forward. One is China and the One Belt, One Road initiative, and the fact that that increasingly the Chinese are going to be playing a role in the Middle East, and that this is something that we need to be very aware of. It's not entirely clear what the Chinese relationship is going to be. We saw King Salman's visit to Beijing on his tour of Asia Pacific, that unlike his stop in Tokyo or his stop in Indonesia or Malaysia, seemed to have two key objectives. One, of course, was the economic objective. I think that certainly the Saudis see the importance of China in terms of their own economic futures, not only on the energy sector, but what they're trying to do in terms of diversifying their economy. But the other area is, again, Iran, and the fact that the Saudis clearly would like to pull China a little bit away from Iran and more towards a more neutral position. Chinese seemed at that moment to be willing to play that kind of a game. They made a number of positive statements about the potential for them to play a role in helping to ease tensions in the region and to help Iran and Saudi Arabia mediate their differences. This is potentially, from a U.S. perspective, an important development and something that we need to keep our eye on. If the Chinese do decide that it's in their interest to come into the Middle East in a big way, as almost certainly they will. The other issue I wanted to note is the change within the Sunni Arab world, and what I think is very significant in terms of the growing assertiveness of the Gulf states in driving the broader Arab world and ensuring, in a way that was never the case in the past, that it's really the concerns of the Gulf Arabs that are achieving a priority consideration by the broader Arab world, as opposed to the tradition, which is really that the Gulf Arabs financed Egypt's foreign policy and were willing to simply be guided by whatever the Egyptians considered to be their core interests. That's no longer the case. We've seen the willingness on the part of the Saudis to push back very hard on Egypt when they felt that the Egyptians were taking positions that were contrary to Saudi interests. I think that the other aspect of this is the growing military engagement by not only the Saudis but also the Emiratis in Africa, in Djibouti, in Ethiopia, in Somalia, where you see for the very first time the Gulf Arabs very much a military presence in the Red Sea, and that there's also an economic component to this as the Gulf Arabs buy up agricultural land in Africa, very interested in irrigation projects, taking a position that is contrary to the Egyptian position on things like the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which, if you're buying agricultural land in Sudan, you might think is a pretty important thing, whether the Egyptians like it or not. So there is a whole new set of issues that are developing, and a whole new way that the Gulf Arabs are asserting themselves and their presence in the broader Middle East than they have ever done before. That, again, is going to be an issue that we're going to have to deal with as we go forward. So let me stop there. I've talked for a long time.
Oh, that's fine. You will have other opportunities once we develop the dialogue. Okay, so let's move on.
I'll be more brief. First, but I will thank Professor Alexander for inviting me. I'm glad that I was able to come. When I saw the question, is there a new strategic order in the Middle East, I think there has been since 2003, and the main driver of that new strategic order, of course, was the George W. Bush administration, when it invaded Iraq and got rid of Saddam Hussein and upset the traditional Iraq-Iran Sunni Shia balance in the region, and we're still living with the after effects of that. Iran is an opportunistic power. It took advantage of the chaos in Iraq to become very influential. It would never have achieved that kind of prominence if not for the U.S. invasion. So we are where we are, certainly in Iraq, and I don't think anything that was agreed to in Riyadh will affect that. In terms of the situation in Syria, Likewise, I'm not sure that there's some new strategy emerging. The United States still does not seem terribly willing to put boots on the ground there. There does seem to be some greater desire to prevent the Iranians from building a land bridge that goes through Iraq into Syria and to the Mediterranean. But again, that remains to be seen whether that can be accomplished. I was glad that President Trump went to Riyadh, given the very Islamophobic nature of his campaign, that he went to a Muslim country and was well received and seemed to leave with a positive impression. I think that was good. But I was worried, frankly, about the rhetoric that he used against Iran, and I had this sort of split screen feeling through the weekend, because in Tehran, people were dancing in the streets, celebrating an election, which, of course, offered limited choices, but was nevertheless an election in which 74% of the population, or the eligible population, participated, while on the other screen we had President Trump in Saudi Arabia, a hereditary monarchy, with no real elections and no real ability for people to protest, certainly. There was this tremendously ignorant comment by Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, marveling that there had been no protests in Riyadh when Trump was there, not realizing, of course, that you could get your head chopped off, literally, if you had had the temerity to protest against the king and what the king was doing. So I thought that Trump's remarks, he also had a kind of neoconish line in there about how he prayed for the day when Iranians would be able to have, the government that they so justly deserved and so on. Well, they may not have the government that they all want, but nevertheless, this large number of people came out and participated in elections, which suggested that they were not as infuriated about their situation as Trump might have indicated. And I just thought it was a very tone-deaf remark on the part of President Trump. If he is talking about counterterrorism and mobilizing the Muslim world, he cannot leave out the Shia portion of it, and he can't simply, of course, blame everything on Iran when the ideology that unfortunately motivates or seems to be part of the sickness of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, a lot of it originated in Saudi Arabia. So I just thought that was a particularly strange thing to say. What are some other things that we can say about the situation? I think there's a potential silver lining to Trump's embrace of the Saudis. If he can make them feel more secure and more comfortable in their own skins, perhaps they might be more willing to engage in a dialogue with Iran. I think there was a tremendous sense of anxiety after the nuclear agreement was achieved, that President Obama was not just pivoting away from the Middle East, but that within the Middle East he was pivoting toward Tehran and away from Riyadh. And so Trump, I think, has done a service by hopefully making the Saudis feel more secure that the United States will be with them, supports them in their very ambitious reform policies, which I think we all have to hope will succeed for the sake of the region and Saudi youth. And if this gives the Saudis extra confidence, I think that would be a good thing. I'm not sure it will. As President Obama pointed out, and this used to drive the Saudis crazy, I mean, their real problems are internal, of course, and they have to do with the fact that their society is not very productive, that they've depended on oil revenues all these years, and they're going to be in a very difficult situation in a few years if they can't diversify the economy and find some other way to pay their bills. They may even be importing oil by 2030 if they can't reduce their energy consumption. So these are internal problems. Similarly, if you look at a country like Bahrain, where, by the way, they just killed 5 Shia protesters the other day, their repression of the majority of their population, which is Shia, is at the root of their problems. And while Iran may be encouraging that, Iran was not the reason that the Shia rose up in 2011 against the monarchy in Bahrain. We look at other countries in the region and we see that it's primarily the oppression of Shia minorities, or in some cases majorities or pluralities that have led to internal problems, and Iran has played on that, but it did not create those situations. So the Saudis, I mean, if they take Trump's endorsement as an excuse to double down on their repression of the Shia, if they do not open up their society in a way that I think is necessary for all Saudis, then that will be a missed opportunity. But if they do take this embrace as a reason to show more self-confidence and treat their own population a bit better and also reach out to the Iranians, I think we could be in a better place. On other issues, I agree with Ambassador Firestein very much. If you look at the Arab-Israeli dispute, I mean, Iran's main problem with Israel and Israel's main problem with Iran is that Iran has given tremendous backing to groups that purport to be supporting the Palestinians in their cause against the Israelis. If the Israelis were actually able to begin a peace process that led to a Palestinian state, that would deprive the Iranians of their main card to play in the Middle East, frankly, and it would be an interesting process to observe. In the past, Iranian leaders have said that they would not be more Palestinian than the Palestinians. If the Palestinians could reach an agreement, the Iranians would support it. Hezbollah now, of course, is very embroiled in all of the other regional disputes. It's been rather careful toward the Israelis, even as Israel has bombed Hezbollah in Syria several times, has tried to prevent arms from being delivered through Syria to Hezbollah. One could argue that actually the civil war in Syria has not been a bad thing from the Israeli perspective, because it has bogged down both Hezbollah and the Iranians in that very unfortunate war. Again, if the Israelis feel now comforted by Trump's embrace, perhaps we could see a little more courage on that side, but I'm not terribly optimistic there. I think a lot of Israelis are just very comfortable with the status quo. I think that's probably where I'll stop. We can talk more, if you like, in the Q&A about the Iranian elections. I will make one point, and I think I'm hugely relieved, I'd say. I'm not sure I'm hugely optimistic, but I'm hugely relieved that Hassan Rouhani was reelected. I wrote a piece for the Atlantic Council saying that it was a vote for competence over ideology. And Iranians, seeing the chaos all around them and the new hostility coming from Washington, wanted a safe pair of hands, I think, to move forward, someone who has a proven record of being able to negotiate with the international community, even negotiate with the United States, someone who is very pragmatic and very temperate in his rhetoric. And so I think it's a huge relief that Rouhani will be there. Iran will be very careful. Rouhani was asked at a press conference after his reelection, what did he think about Trump's remarks in Saudi Arabia and so on. And he said, I think we'll wait for the Trump administration to settle down before we come to any conclusions. And of course, the Trump administration has renewed the necessary sanctions waivers to keep the nuclear deal going. And this is the most important thing from the Iranian point of view. Ambassador Firestein mentioned China. China, Russia, and the Europeans are all very insistent that this nuclear deal be maintained. They want to improve their economic ties with Iran. And so I think the United States has to be very careful about imposing new sanctions. The Senate also imposing new sanctions that could be interpreted as violating the nuclear agreement and putting the onus on the United States for sabotaging what has so far proven to be a very successful agreement in terms of keeping Iran from moving forward toward developing nuclear weapons. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Yona, for inviting me for the fourth time, I think. We are looking at the question whether a new Middle East strategy order is emerging. And my answer is a qualified yes. Because based on the discussions at the summit and Trump's subsequent visit to Israel and the Ramallah, I don't think that a strategy is either emerging or the prospects are very high. The summit was made up primarily of leaders with a common hate for Iran. But the irony is that while they were criticizing Iran, Iran was celebrating, as Barbara said, the election of a new president, whereas many of the participants in the summit, a citizen will go to prison for a number of years if he were to talk about elections. The second point is that this harmony in Riyadh was quickly broken 2 days after the conclusion of the summit. This morning, there's an article in Sharq al-Awsat by Emir of Qatar at-Tamimi, who said the issue is not armaments, the issue is not weapons agreements, the issue is how to deal with economic issues and how to deal with social issues. And this is the first time also that Tamimi hinted that we can't take Trump very seriously because he has investigation going against him in Washington. This is all this morning. Now, let me start with a couple of general observations. Now, not surprisingly that most of the participants at the summit were Muslims, although there were some heads of governments who were Christians from Burkina Faso and Guyana. And the American delegation had also some Jews. But there was not a single Shiite official in that conference.
The Azeri?
What?
The Azeri.
Azeri, well, okay. But I mean, let's say from the Middle East, there was not a single Shiite official from the Middle East. And this is also reflected in the invitation sent by Saudi Arabia, not to the Shiite-led Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi, but they sent it to the President, Fuad Massoum, who's a Kurd, a Sunni, and powerless. And you can see the discrimination in that Saudi Arabia extended an invitation to the Prime Minister of Lebanon, who is Sunni, rather than the President. Yet in the case of Iraq, they send it to the powerless President rather than to the Prime Minister.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now the summit in Saudi Arabia covered 4 themes. I'll deal with them very briefly. The first was enhancing the role of the moderate Arab states, especially Saudi Arabia. Second, containing the role of Iran. Third was fighting terrorism. And fourth, addressing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is de rigueur in any conference involving the Arab countries. Let me deal with the first one, enhancing the role of modern states. The Saudi press has noted with the great honor, that Trump chose Saudi Arabia as his first country to visit as a new president. This is very important for them, very prestigious, that he did not go to Canada as traditionally president did, or to Mexico. He came to Saudi Arabia. And they felt that this visit will help restore the historical relations between Saudi Arabia and the United States, which they thought was fractured during the 8 years of the presidency of Barack Obama. One particular writer in the Sharq al-Awsat, Salman al-Dusri, point out that the decline of the United States influence in the past 8 years were not uncommon or unknown to President Trump. But he thought that the visit will help strengthen that coalition, that collaboration between Saudi Arabia and between the United States and the rest of the Gulf countries. I think the importance of the summit of the Arab countries is that it renewed the commitment of the United States toward these countries, and I think they took advantage or took note of the oft-repeated statement by the President that the United States will not allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons. This was repeated multiple times, and I think they took notice of it. Now, when he arrived in Israel, and I'll come back later on to his visit to Israel, Trump spoke of the tremendous progress has been made. He said, I think a lot of that progress has been made because of the aggression of Iran. And if you look at King Salman and Saudi Arabia and others that I was with, it was something. What is that something? I don't know, but it was something that he noticed there. Okay. What was really changed is that Obama believed that Saudi Arabia should share the Middle East with Iran. Trump's approach is overtly hostile to Iran. That it creates a clear basis for an alliance with the Saudis. The arms deal, I talk a little bit about the arms deals. Everybody knows that Saudi Arabia and Iran signed an arms deal for $110 billion, and there is a pending larger agreement for $350 billion over the last 5 years, next 5 years. In a statement to Al Arabiya, President Trump described the deal as involving lots of beautiful things. Lots of beautiful things.
The president is so
Hotels,
articulate.
maybe.
However, upon signing the agreement, he said, jobs, he forgot about Iran, and he forgot about ISIS, and he said, jobs, jobs, jobs. But there's the issue really about, I don't want to get into it in detail now, but the IMF issued a report back in 2015 that Saudi Arabia will run out of foreign reserves by 2020. They're running a deficit of about 80 or $90 billion a year. So how are they going to finance this package, and how would they finance even the largest package remain to be seen. I think, however, that Prince Mohammed bin, the deputy crown prince,
Salman.
the son of King Salman, he is counting on issuing an IPO, initial public offering of Aramco, the oil company, which will mobilize $200 billion. And I think that will replenish the dwindling foreign reserves of Saudi Arabia.
Interesting.
The Saudis needed the agreement also because they were there's a sense of panic in Saudi Arabia. And the panic arises from the fact that the Houthis have acquired long-term, long-range missiles from Iran, and they're firing these missiles as Saudi territory. And one of these missiles hit an area close to Riyadh.
They're longer-range Scuds. I mean,
You
they're
know,
still
it's like, okay,
Scuds,
yeah, but I mean, they're able now to hit the territory of Saudi Arabia, and they're really panicked if that's, there's a flow of missiles hitting their territory, and they feel that the weapon deal is necessary to both offensive and defensive reasons.
Interesting.
The second issue was containing Iran, and a lot of things have been said already about Iran. And I mentioned something very interesting. On the eve of Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia, the United States Air Force attacked and destroyed a column of Shiite volunteers trying to move on the Damascus-Baghdad highway to establish, as you mentioned, a sort of a contiguous connection between Iran and Lebanon through Iraq and Syria.
Mm-hmm.
The United States claimed that the column was a threat to a post which was manned by U.S. and Norwegian, I don't know how Norwegian got there, but Norwegian forces. That's a clear state. There's some Norwegian force, and the United States.
Well, the Norwegians are on the border with the UN.
Yeah, so they said is a threat to U.S. and Norwegian unit, and they said the post is a red line, And I think what they tried to convey to Syria and its supporters that henceforth a red line is a red line. So that's really a very important development.
Interesting.
Last night, and I this morning, with the help of a small U.S. airborne force, with the help of to help the Syrian army, Free Syrian Army, which is financed and helped by the United States, they have initiated what they call the Desert Volcano Battle, Ma'rakat Burkan al-Badia, to expel Iranian militias from the Syrian, Jordanian, Iraqi border. So the United States intervention is really also supported by actual military intervention in Syria to expel Iran from there. The third issue, and I'll touch very briefly on terrorism. As I think you said, or Barbara said, the countries don't have the ability to expel the terrorists. The question is not just physical force of expelling them. The problem is there is an ample sources of finance to keep them going. And it is no more easy to dry that source of finance than to dry the swamp in Washington that Trump talks about. So really, there's so many individuals that contribute money to these groups that the government themselves may decide we're not going to support terrorism, we're not going to finance terrorism. But in Saudi Arabia, the buckets outside every store where people may contribute cash for the sake of Al-Qaeda and other organizations. And that is not going to be stopped. Finally, let me talk briefly about the Trump visit to Israel and the Palestinian territory. I think the election of President Trump, it triggered a lot of expectations among the right-wing Israeli government and particularly among the settlers. They hoped that under Trump they would have a carte blanche in terms of settlements. They do whatever they want. They thought the United States will transfer the embassy to Jerusalem and may even recognize unified Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. I think they discovered soon, quickly enough, that these expectations were unrealistic. None of that has happened during the Trump's short visit to Israel. And the liberal Israeli daily Haaretz pointed out the bottom line is that not only does Trump have no intention of jeopardizing his relations with Sunni Arab leaders by moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem, he wouldn't even make the tiniest gesture by allowing Netanyahu to join him for a few minutes in the old city to visit the Western Wall. And that led the very well-known commentator in Haaretz with rather cynical comment saying that that Trump visit to the wall maybe because he loves big buildings and has been gripped recently with a passion for walls.
Maybe rebuild it.
As for Netanyahu, Haaretz observed, Netanyahu thought he removed a thorn when he got rid of Obama, but he has found himself lost in a grove of thistles. Anyway, so Trump went to Ramallah. He spoke to President Mahmoud Abbas, and he promised that he will do his best to help renew the negotiation with the Israelis. The thing that is important, that Trump is personally committed to doing the ultimate deal, and neither Israel nor the Palestinians want to be the one he holds responsible for failure. So I think both of them will make the necessary concessions to meet. Whether there will be an agreement is doubtful. In the meantime, the conflict persists. I'd like one more comment about the way Trump treated in Saudi Arabia. Unprecedented pomp and circumstance you have all seen on television. But what is really significant is what they wrote in the local newspapers. I mention in particular an article or two articles by Khalid al-Malik, who is the editor-in-chief of a government daily, Al Jazeera, not related to Al Jazeera TV. And in a short article, he referred to Trump as Ra'is al-Shuja', the courageous president. But they went even further in his praise. He said that Trump had uncommon historic leadership, capable of reading reality, touching on the important issues, and searching for solutions. I think, and I conclude here, that Trump's 2 days visit to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was the best 2 days in his presidency. And he will not soon forget it.
For him.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Bravo.
Okay.
Thank you. That's it.
And Professor
Very
Don-
briefly.
Don Wallace, and then we'll have a discussion.
I'm going to make two promises. One, I'm not going to be nearly as interesting as Nimrod, Barbara Slavin, or the ambassador. And secondly, I'm not going to mention Donald Trump. Going to the title, New Middle East Strategic Order. Of course, Middle East can be both narrow or broad, but we'll just leave that. Order, order, what's written about the word order, could just mean the reality. What is the new reality? Or it could mean order, stability, etc. Sort of like the Congress of Vienna in 1815 imposed an order of a rather conservative variety. My own hunch is that we won't see much change. My background's rather different from my colleagues. I'm a lawyer, and my business is really economic development, the legal aspects. I was the lawyer to Qatar. I was the regional lawyer for the United States government in the Middle East. The institute of which I'm the chairman, the International Institute, is basically a capacity builder. So I respond to everyone who says those are the real issues. In fact, quite frankly, as a law professor, I can afford to be, as a professor, irresponsible. And my own feeling is that everything we talk about at the Potomac Institute, by which I'm educated and fascinated, is really secondary to the underlying social, economic, cultural, historical realities. And everyone says that at these meetings. Tony Blair, who no one dares mention him, my wife's English, and she would mention him, but not nicely. But he once said, when he was running for office for I think, you don't run to be prime minister, but it was an election. He said, I'm going to be tough on crime and the causes of crime. I thought it was rather clever, and it's quite different from the international situation, which we confront here all the time with terrorism, etc. But in a sense, it's really the underlying realities which are crucial. And of course, the U.S. will have very little to do with that and knows very little about it. So that would be my first point. My second point is, talking about order, I lived in Turkey. I was the regional lawyer for the Middle East, and I went to Iran regularly. And, if you look at the Middle East, just say over the last 2,000 years, Joe and I would have said that's a short time to judge anything, but who are the great peoples of the Middle East? The Arabs certainly came from the south. The Turks came from the east, pushed by the Mongols. The Iranians were probably pushed by the Turks and the Mongols. And then you have the Jews, the Israelis, who were there long ago and more recently. I don't know, this is probably terrible to say, but I think of the Afro-Persia is probably the kind of the most continuous civilization. Now, it's true in the famous caliphate of Harun al-Rashid and the others. It was an Arab caliphate basically manned by Persians. And to be brutal about it, I think it's a mistake to underestimate Iran. And although it's very easy, I'm a Republican who admires Obama. That's a very difficult situation in which to be.
Select groups.
I think Obama was right about the nuclear deal, which is a success, which of course is condemned by Netanyahu probably every morning before his prayers. And
He doesn't pray.
He doesn't pray.
sorry, maybe his wife's prayers, what?
He's atheist. He doesn't.
He's an
pray.
atheist, well,
Yeah.
before his observations. I mean, I think the hope had been, of course, that this would be the first step. I sort of feel sorry for Rouhani, who seems like a very rational man, given the fact, he's be turban. I quite frankly, if I were to take the long view of, quote, the order in the Middle East, 100 years from now, what will you see? I doubt you're going to see these, and I say it was Qatar's lawyer, I doubt you're going to see these sheikdoms in the form they're in now. It's not going to be sheikdoms. And what you are going to see is Iran. And of course, it was pointed out by everyone, one of the ironies of the last few decades was to knock off Saddam Hussein, of course a horrible man, I would call him a bastard, and his sons were worse, but they were a balance to Iran, which gives you a sense of how America does not think about strategic orders. I mean, Henry Kissinger does, but Americans don't. And I think we just have to be frank about that. And forget the day-to-day difficulties of the Saudis, who have been trying to diversify their economy, pushed by a lot of people for many, many years, quite unsuccessfully. I'm sort of admiring the Gulf, little countries with a lot of money who really are, and particularly Qatar, are really hitting over their weight. But I really think that we have to step back, and whether Donald Trump would be capable of that, he's capable of anything, Who knows? Maybe he'll eventually discover, maybe he'll take a trip to Tehran, who knows? Anyway, those are my observations.
Okay. Very good, General. Would you like to? Okay.
Don't see that happening.
Obviously, I think we had some very rich insights from all the panelists, and we can spend not only the next 15 minutes, or 20 minutes, or half an hour, but a semester to deal with that. Let me just ask a general question that each one can discuss. I took some notes, noting some of the important points. Let me ask about the new strategic order and how Professor Don Wallace tried to deal with that. Just imagine what might happen if we have a breakthrough on the Palestinian-Israeli issue, if we have the so-called normalization of the Arabs' relationship with Israel before we have final negotiations and peace. In other words, to reverse, you were talking absolutely correctly and according to the record about the Madrid conference, which was the first time that the parties were together. Ironically, also with the participation of Prime Minister Shamir, of all prime ministers, and so on, and the Jordanian initiative and the Saudi initiative and everything else. The question is, if we have some initiative on the part of the Saudis and the Gulf and other countries like Egypt that we didn't really discuss at all at this point, and their role. So this is one of the issues. Secondly, I think in terms of the role of Russia, we spoke about China, and this is the big puzzle. And of course, every single day we hear about the connection or link or whatever with the administration or with the campaign staff and all that. So the role of Russia. Now the new strategic order, which I don't think we try to explain, it seems to me, and we saw some writing on the wall, if you will, the land bridge between Iran and Iraq and Syria, I think that you referred to, and Lebanon, we're talking about the Shiites with the support of Russia. And then another kind of coalition between Iran and Turkey and Russia as well. So I think, you know, it can be movements, the so-called unexpected developments, and I wonder what you think about that. Okay.
Want me to start? Okay.
Not only Barbara, anyone else.
Well, you know, I think we've had this sort of Shia crescent thing has been running around. King Abdullah of Jordan was the first to raise it after the U.S.
Now they refer to it as the Persian crescent.
Yeah, after the U.S. invaded Iraq and got rid of Saddam Hussein. So I mean, I don't see this as something terribly new. Since the U.S. opened Iraq to Iran, which is what we did, you know, they've had this ability, and they've had an alliance with Assad's in Syria going back to the Iran-Iraq War, when the Syrians were the only Arabs, the only regional power to support Iran against Iraq. So I see it more as a kind of intensification of something that's already that already exists. We have to remember Shias are a minority in the Muslim world, and they're a majority, however, around the Persian Gulf, which is one of the reasons for this tremendous Saudi insecurity about Iran's role. And there, clearly, they are looking for the United States to somehow hold the tide against Shia aspirations. But, you know, as long as they're discriminated against, I mean, while Trump was in Riyadh, I think the Saudis were destroying some houses in the Shia portion of Saudi Arabia, which is in the eastern province where the oil is. The Bahrainis, as I mentioned, just killed 5 Shia protesters. And this is, you know, a crisis that's been going on since 2011. There are large Shia populations in Kuwait also. So Iraq, Lebanon, you know, I think that there isn't a military solution to dealing with this, that there's going to have to be some sort of modus vivendi between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They need to sit and negotiate over Yemen, which is not a major priority for Iran. Iran, I think, would easily drop any support it has for the Houthis in return for a change in Saudi policy. The Iranians and, of course, the Saudis have fallen apart since the nuclear deal, but there have been a number of incidents. The Iranians have been able to negotiate with the Saudis to restore access to the Hajj, which is very important. A number of Iranians died in a stampede in the Hajj a few years back. Iranians trashed the Saudi embassy in Tehran, and that's when the Saudis broke diplomatic relations a couple of years ago, after the Saudis executed a Shia sheikh, Sheikh Nimr. It would be great if the Saudis could be induced to reopen that embassy and send an ambassador back. The Iranians need to compensate the Saudis for the damage that was done. And during the presidential campaign, Rouhani explicitly criticized one of his rivals, Tehran Mayor Kalibaf, for associating himself with people who were involved in the trashing of the Saudi embassy, and said, how can you expect anybody to want to come to Iran or invest in Iran when we allow embassies to be attacked? You know, there are a lot of interesting things swirling around here. So it would be good if the Saudis and the Iranians could somehow sit down and begin to hash out some of this. But I don't think you're going to be able to stop Shia in the region from advocating for their own interests, certainly not while they're heavily discriminated against by Sunni rulers. So it's not just Iran. These countries have to confront their own internal problems and deal with them in a non-military, non-authoritarian way.
Ambassador,
Yeah, I would basically I agree with Barbara. I would just make a couple of additional points. I think that, you know, one of the problems that we have is that you never know which Iran you're dealing with, and there is a lot of optimism that with Hassan Rouhani's re-election, that perhaps there will be an opening, you know, where diplomacy can be more effective. I certainly agree that we should test that proposition. I think it's foolish of us, to not even consider that there might be that change. But having said that, I think we also need to keep in mind that at least in the case of Yemen, in the case of Syria, in the case of many of these issues where our concerns are the highest, where regional concerns are the highest, decision-making is not in the hands of Hassan Rouhani or Foreign Minister Zarif. It's in the hands of the Ayatollah Khamenei and the hardliners who are around him, the IRGC. And the question is whether or not they are willing to back away. And is there an Iranian vision of a region that is more positive for them and more conducive for them, that does not push these kind of regional ambitions? You can say I don't disagree with Barbara that part of the problem is the oppression of Shia minority populations in the region. Certainly that's true in Bahrain and to a certain extent in Saudi Arabia. In Bahrain, of course, majority population. But in an instance, for example, like Yemen, the Zaydis are not really Shia. They're Shia only, but if you kind of close one eye and peer around the corner. And so, what is the justification for Iran's intervention in Yemen? There really is only one issue there, and that is their desire to provoke Saudi Arabia and to threaten Saudi security. So actually, I do think that if the Iranians, if there's a new Iranian strategy, if Rouhani has now come into office and he can sit down with Khamenei, functionally or if not literally, sit down with Khamenei and say, look, what we need to do over these next few years is really focus on the economy, on domestic issues, and the only way we're going to have the space to do that is if we can reduce tensions in the region. The one place that I would say would be the easiest for them to start would be in Yemen, because their interests there are the least. They have no historic relationship with Yemen, and they have no enduring reason to want to be there. If they were to do that, then that could begin some momentum towards allowing the Iranians to reconcile a little bit, maybe not so much with Saudi Arabia. And again, we saw from December of last year, when after the GCC summit, we had the Kuwaitis visiting Tehran. We had the Rouhani and Zarif visits to Oman, Kuwait, and Qatar. Clearly they were trying to get a sense of whether or not there was some room to maneuver among the other smaller GCC states and maybe deal with Saudi Arabia separately. That might still be their strategy. That might still be something that they might try to do, and they might be successful at it. And the irony of all of this, and Barbara and I were on a panel a couple of months ago, and I think we talked about this. The irony is that the motivator, the person who's driving this consideration and this tactic is Donald Trump. Because if I were the Iranians and I wanted to get away from this confrontation in the Gulf so that I could start taking care of more important issues for me, like the economic development and like trying to modernize the oil infrastructure and begin to get some money back, I would much rather try to work on the Gulf states than on Washington. I think the prospect is much better, and so you could see where there would be some room to maneuver on these things, but it all begins in Tehran, and what is Iran's vision for its role in the region, and how it sees its way moving forward. And let me stop there.
One anecdote and one comment. I had a Saudi friend a Shiite from eastern Saudi Arabia. He said, "Let me remind you that Allah in His generosity has placed most oil under Shia's control. It's Iraq, southern Iraq, Shia, it's Iran, it's eastern Saudi
Eastern
Arabia."
Province, yeah.
The comment is about, you mentioned, Yona, you asked about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Peace Index, which is published once a month in Israel, the most recent one shows that 60% of the Israelis are not keen about having a Palestinian state. Mr. Netanyahu himself and his right-wing supporters do not wish to have a Palestinian state. And in fact, they were gratified that Mr. President Trump did not mention once two states side by side. So there is a possibility for some normalization between Israel and some of the Gulf countries, but I would suspect that the ceiling will be very low. I don't expect, major breakthrough in normalization. As everybody knows, unless there is a genuine agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And in Ramallah, when Trump visited the West Bank, there was a mix of optimism and disenchantment or disinterest, because I felt that Netanyahu would not engage, not provide really, or take a bold step toward an agreement with the Palestinians. So I think, in my view, I am pessimistic about it, that the conflict will linger on, because basically the maximum Israel can offer the Palestinians will be below what the Palestinians will accept, and the conflict will continue beyond my life on this earth.
Okay, Don, I'm going to let you, but I must have a little footnote to what you said. You spoke about the two-state solution, maybe one-state solution. How about three-state solution? How about Gaza?
Oh yeah, I'm glad. I was going to mention.
Who speaks for the Palestinians?
Yeah, Gaza really is. They issued recently a new charter, and it's supposed to be more liberal than the previous charter. What is really important about the new charter, it indicates a shift in Gaza from an Iranian hegemony toward influence by Egypt. I think we see now in Gaza a shift toward Egyptian influence and discarding Iranian influence. That is a major change. Now, how far would they go with this? I don't know, but this is certainly an important change. To what extent Abbas himself has any prospect of bringing Gaza into the negotiating table, that's really a question, is yet to be resolved.
Well, obviously, this is we can continue the discussion for a very long time, depending on you spoke about the moderate charter. Meanwhile, they are arming themselves with the support of Iran. Let's move on, Professor Don Wallace. I know you want to make a comment.
I want to start with Egypt, but I want to repeat your question, Yona. You said, what would be the effect of a successful peace negotiation and an adoption by the Arab countries of acceptance of Israel? And we've seen lots of suggestions that it's difficult. And this leads to a question, but first with Egypt. I was once talking to an upper-class Egyptian, young, educated woman, and she surprised me. She said, Iran is crucial because Iran will vindicate our interests against Israel. It wasn't particularly anti-Semitic, but she was saying Iran, this was 3 or 4 years ago, would be the champion of all the Muslims in the Middle East against Israel. In other words, she saw it as a strong state. Okay. The reason I say that is because I wonder, my question is a question to all of you. Why is Iran so aggressive? My own hunch is that it has something to do with Palestine. Because that goes back, today everyone says the problems are domestic in the Arab countries. It's not Israel, it's not the sort of intrusion from the West. But that wasn't the case 20, 30 years ago. Israel was seen as an intrusion in the Muslim world. And Iran, along the way, picked up a in a sense, championed that attitude, along with a lot of other motives. So I guess my question goes back to Yona's question. If, in fact, there were, and it may be counterintuitive, counter this, counterfactual, counter everything, if there were, in fact, a settlement, two-state or otherwise, and therefore the fever went down, and then the Arabs, per Madrid or wherever, said we now recognize Israel. Let's say that were to happen. That was your question, Yona. What do you think would then happen in the Middle East and the order we're talking about?
Okay, Barbara, and then we'll have the discussion.
I mean, I think it's well known that after the Islamic Revolution adopted the Palestinian cause as a way to try to prove that it was a pan-Islamic movement, not just a Shia revolution. Right. That's why they wrap themselves literally in the keffiyeh, and Yasser Arafat was one of the first visitors to Tehran after the Shah fell to come and embrace Khomeini and so on. Anyone who knows Iran and knows Iranians know they sympathize with the Palestinians, but they really don't care that much about any of these causes, frankly. Arab causes, they call them. They're much more focused on their own well-being, and there are always demonstrations. You know, in 2009 there was one, what was it? No Lebanon, no Palestine, my life only for Iran. That was one of the chants in 2009 at the demonstrations protesting the fraudulent re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. So if there were a deal, any kind of deal, the vast majority of Iranians, I'm sure, would support it, and it would make it very hard for the government to continue to justify any sort of support for a group like Hamas in particular. You know, but we're not there, and I don't know that we're ever going to get there. So.
Okay, obviously I have also comments, but I won't go into it because I think it is unrealistic to indicate that if only the Arab-Israeli conflict, I went through that for the past 60 years, so I have first knowledge, I think, and experience, and I really think even if Israel had not existed, we would have a problem. And when the Iranians attacked through the Hezbollah, the U.S. Marine headquarters in Beirut, it had nothing to do with Palestine or so.
But the Israelis invaded Lebanon. That's why, to get rid of the PLO, which was why our Marines got sent there. So I beg to differ. I think it was all connected to that.
Why did the Marines get sent there?
The Marines were sent to stabilize Beirut after the Israeli invasion got rid of the PLO. Beirut was actually a much safer place for Americans when Fatah was there than after they were expelled. After they were expelled, Hezbollah rose up. But that's another discussion we could have.
Okay, I'm going to call on, can you get the mic to
Milton Honig. Okay.
Identify yourself.
Milton Honig, that's my name. It's about Iran. Okay, the U.S. has agreed that the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, is working and has waived certain sanctions on oil, etc. But then, at the same time, it's always noted that there's a reevaluation of the entire Iran situation going on right now, and the conclusion of that is expected. It's considering Trump's statements about the Iran agreement, the worst deal ever made. What can you expect from that ongoing evaluation? What could be the outcome which could be other than saying that the agreement should go on? This would have really be a very sensational result. So what, Barbara, for instance, do you think might be the outcome of that evaluation?
The people here who've served in the U.S. government know that a policy review is what you do when you don't have any idea what to do. So I expect this policy review to go on for a very long time. There's been no end date set for it. However, there are some issues that the Trump administration will have to examine at some point. There are elements of the deal that sunset after 10 and 15 years. There's the question of Iran's missile development, which remains still very controversial. So I'm going to make an advertisement. On June the 13th at the Atlantic Council, we're going to present about 8 papers on how to bolster, strengthen, extend the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, written by all sorts of very interesting authors. So I invite you to come and take a look and read some of these. I think the administration will keep to the letter of the deal. I think they've already killed the spirit of it with the travel ban, which was impacted Iran and Iranian Americans more than any other group that was targeted. I'm worried about the rhetoric that's been used and so on. But the Iranians are going to abide by it, and as long as they do, I think the agreement will continue. The other parties to it, and this is an international agreement blessed by the UN Security Council, the other parties to it want it to continue. So I don't see it disappearing, but I'm afraid that opportunities for U.S.-Iran engagement are not going to be there for a very long time.
The other panelists, if not over there, then over there. Okay. Yes. Right there. Please identify yourself.
Thank you. Mohammed Ashwaiter. I'm from Yemen, from American University, Washington College of Law. Ambassador Frischstein mentioned the counterterrorism, policy and the strategy. If we don't see, as I can see, that the Islamic countries, they don't put much effort in counter the narrative, is there a way to empower individual or NGOs to play such a role in counter the narrative for, terrorism?
Well, I think that the issue that I have with this countering extremist messaging, which we've been doing for a very long time, and we've tried in many different formats, and we've tried to go in and debate with people on social media, and now we have the center in Abu Dhabi, and we have another center in Riyadh. The problem that I have with all of this is that by the time you're dealing with people who are reading extremist websites or literature or whatever, you've already missed your opportunity to influence them. The opportunity to influence people's thinking is before they become radicalized, not after they become radicalized. There have been programs that we've worked on where, the interesting thing is if you go back and if you look at where people are being recruited to go to Syria or Iraq to join Daesh or Nusra or Al-Qaeda, there are often very, limited places. I mean, these are people who are coming out of 1 or 2 villages in Tunisia, for example, or in Morocco. And if you go to those places and try to deal with the population there, and you try to engage the leadership there, the social leaders, the political leaders, economic leaders, you might have a better understanding of what it is that's driving this radicalization. You might be able to affect it. But that's very, very retail engagement. I mean, that's really focusing. And a lot of it, frankly speaking, and it goes back to what Dr. Wallace said, and he's absolutely right. At the end of the day, an awful lot of this stuff in our part of the world, in the Middle East, it's economic, it's social. I don't think that's true in Paris, and I don't think it's true in London. I don't think that this guy in Manchester yesterday was motivated by economic privation. I think that when you're dealing with Europeans, with Chechnya or whatever, you've got a different set of problems. But in the Middle East, I think that you're dealing with economic and social issues, and you need to address those. And arguing with people about what the 15th Surah says or means is useless. I mean, this is my view.
Okay, one more.
Stanley Kober. We're talking about the future of the Middle East. I think we also have to talk about Turkey, especially in light of what happened here a few days ago. It's not just the foreign policy issues. And this is a particular challenge for President Trump, who stresses America first. How can he not respond to the statement out of Ankara effectively blaming the Metropolitan Police for what took place? If you don't have a strong response to that, how can you say you favor America first?
You know, Stanley, haven't seen you for a while. I have friends who are trying to construct a lawsuit against the Turkish government because, you know, this apparently happened because Erdogan was in the residence. I think he was. And these demonstrations took place outside the residence, but it had been suggested that Erdogan should have stayed up at the Chancery, you know, up the avenue. So they're planning a lawsuit. We'll see if that happens. You know, Turkey, I mean, Yona, we probably should have a program on Turkey. We've had them before. Because I lived in Turkey. Türkiye seviyorum. I like Turkey. It's tragic, because tragic, it means you wring your hands. That Al Gray, we don't move on tragedy, we move on reality. And what do we do? I think Turkey is worth looking at again. I mean, the question is, Turkey's in NATO. I think Erdogan wants to stay in NATO. Erdogan really does. They are afraid of the Kurds. Of course, he aroused their enmity recently. That's another issue when he, because they were negotiating quite happily with Öcalan, and to get reelected, he basically roused them up again. But Turkey is solid. The question is it solid enough to survive in the form we want? I think that's worth a real lot of thinking, quite frankly. I hope the answer is yes.
Absolutely. Turkey is very important. Don, just a little reminder that we had with this event, we had other events, and again, on a personal, professional level, I developed, as I mentioned before, the academic work with Turkey and Iran before the revolution, and Israel and so forth. At any rate, we'll get back to that. I really think...
you know, I just want to add one small comment, that what happened outside the Turkish residence recently, this was not the first time, but the second time.
That's right.
Really? During Erdogan's first visit, there was the same accident where his bodyguards attacked demonstrators. So there's a tradition.
Right, okay. We have one more, and then we'll make some closing remarks. Please identify yourself for the record.
Hi, Ira Strauss. I think that all the presentations are divided by is there a new order, but they are compatible if we understand them as presenting what are the new and evolving elements in the order or disorder in the Middle East, and there's substantial changes over the decades. And Dr. Slavin would take us back to the Iranian Revolution, which began the displacement of Arab nationalism, radical Arab nationalism, with radical Islamic nationalism as a major motivating force in the region.
There was something that happened in Saudi Arabia, of course, the same
Sure.
year, and then, of course, we had the
Right.
the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So let's
Right.
not put it all on the.
No, okay, fair enough. But the broad point is that there's been a displacement of radical Arab nationalism with Islamic nationalism or Islamism. And that axis of conflict with the world order has sent Arab nationalism into a moderate and pro-world order phase. The collapse of the Soviet Union as a bulwark for radical Arab nationalism exacerbated that in the 1990s, and then the rise of the terrorist wing of Islamic nationalism exacerbated it further as a major axis of conflict with the world order. Then the revival of the Shia-Sunni conflict substantially after the Iraq invasion, but beginning before that certainly, is another axis. The Arab-Israeli conflict greatly diminished as the main axis of trouble in the region, and the withdrawal of American leadership under Obama in favor of multipolarism, inviting everyone into Syria, fighting each other as much as fighting anything that Obama would have approved, and the support of Muslim Brotherhood governments rising to power in Egypt and Tunisia, which didn't survive, but they left those countries in near ruins economically. The support in Turkey for an Islamist government, both under Bush and the European Union and Obama. This has greatly transformed the order over the decades, certainly. And I think all of you have shown that. The one constant you probably all showed in reaction against President Trump supposedly forming a new alliance is to show that this emerged out of the alliance formed, or the coalition formed, by Bush in 2001, which in turn formed out of the partnerships formed by the Atlantic Alliance in the 1990s. So that, I think, is the one element of continuity that you've really shown very well. But I think you've shown very well the rise of new fault axes. I don't know if you'd all take that as showing the compatibility of what you've all said, but I did think it was worth putting it in that context.
Fine. General Gray?
I just was trying to figure out what your question was. He and I, we have this every time over this, but
Right.
Great speech. Why don't we put him on a panel?
Right.
Yeah,
Well,
I
I
mean,
told him.
Yeah, I think you ought to be on one of our panels. That would, you've got a lot of good ideas. Well, this has been a very, very interesting panel, to say the least. And of course, these challenges have been in the Mideast for a long, long time, and they're going to be with us for a long, long time. And but I'm the eternal optimist. I think, some good will come someday. It seems to me that as long as Iran is not controlled really by the government that everybody thinks it is, and is really controlled by the Khomeini idea, the Revolutionary Guards, and those people who have different agendas than the so-called agendas of Iran, we're going to have a challenge in dealing with Iran. And for example, the Revolutionary Guard people who devised the plan to blow up the American embassy in Lebanon in 1983, and to blow up the French headquarters and the American headquarters, as well as parts of another headquarters in that great terrorist attack. They are now principal leaders in Iran. And they've grown with that, and they carry those same hatred ideas. And so we don't want to just overlook this terrorist activity and what it
the
meant.
reasons why the Americans were there to begin with, which was the Israeli invasion. And
No,
there wouldn't have been a Hezbollah if not
the
for
reason
the
that
Israeli
the Americans were there, along with the British and the French and the Italians, were to keep the peace and try to. Well, I'm sorry, but I lost 289 Marine sailors and 3 soldiers. They were all under my command. I went to 163 funerals. So don't tell me why or how our people weren't there. I don't want to get involved in that. That's a different issue. But the point I want to make is that the Hezbollah and the terrorist activities and all of that, and now Hezbollah is very active in Latin America and elsewhere. So this is what I'm saying. This is a concerted effort on the part of Iran to use these activities. That's what I'm saying. Whether the other part doesn't matter, and so that has to be sooner or later. That has to be overthrown or resolved. As long as they're in power, you're not going to be able to have a decent kind of an agreement with Iran, in my view. I just don't see how you can do that. And as far as Israeli and the Palestinians are concerned, you all know much more about that than I do, but just go back through history. You can go back to the 1200s, or you can go back and read any of the major movements in history, and it's always been a triangle of both Islamic thought process and the Jewish process and Christian process as well, and that has a big stake in the area too. And all 3 of the great religions have immense interests and ties to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem, et cetera, and so that's something that. In my humble opinion, each group is going to have to compromise a little bit if you're ever going to have a real chance to have freedom there and to have peace and to go on with life. So that's a different issue. Is there an opportunity in the Mideast, in my opinion, for a new strategic thought process? Sure, there always is. And all strategies have to be adaptive. and certainly any kind of strategy in that part of the world has to be adaptive too. So those are my simple views. But with that, I guess we're going to wrap it up, huh?
Before 2 o'clock.
But we got done before 2 o'clock. That's a first. That's the first symposium in